Good afternoon. Welcome to the Museum of Nebraska History and the Nebraska State Historical Society in this very special brown bag presentation today. My name is Ryan Carmack. I'm the Associate Director for Museums and Historic Sites, and it's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Don Cresswell into the Museum of Nebraska History. Dr. Cresswell is the owner and proprietor of the Philadelphia Print Shop, and he has been since 1981. He is a renowned map and print expert. He's published numerous articles and book reviews, and actually a major reference book entitled The American Revolution in Drawings and Prints, a checklist of 1765 to 1790 graphics in the Library of Congress. Dr. Cresswell may be best known for his many appearances on public television's Antiques Roadshow, and I understand he's coming to Omaha this summer to participate in the Antiques Roadshow that's going to be in Omaha, so keep your eyes open for that. Dr. Cresswell today is going to talk about map making in the age of Lewis and Clark. Dr. Cresswell is here today through the generosity of Marilyn Forkey and her family. Marilyn's donation to the Nebraska State Historical Society of her husband's map collection was the impetus for the exhibit on display right now and the reason we're all here today. So let's welcome Dr. Don Cresswell.
Well, some of you might have seen this sheet being given out. There's more copies on the table as you come in the door, and there's also a little brochure about the Philadelphia Print Shop, so you'll know where I'm coming from. Nobody should panic. There's not going to be a pop quiz in 10 minutes or anything like that. The topic, they asked me to speak on Lewis and Clark, and there's been so much said and written about Lewis and Clark. I wanted to sort of say, what kind of an angle should we give to this? What can I tell the people of Nebraska about what Lewis and Clark's meaning for Nebraska is or so? So I decided to go pre-Lewis and Clark in what I'm going to show you, what we're going to talk about, because what I want to do is get ourselves into the mindset of Lewis and Clark, to see what they were thinking about, where they were coming from. And this is going to be sort of a three-segment talk. First, I'm going to talk about the older tradition of maps and map making. And these would be the kind of things that Lewis and Clark had overcome. And then we'll talk about the situation with map makers in colonial Virginia and what that meant to the people of the United States and how that worked out. And then the third part will be a statement of what was current right at the time that Lewis and Clark began their voyage. So what I want to talk about first is probably the oldest known map, which is on a cuneiform tablet that was done about 500 BC. And this is a form of a symbolic map that was known in the Middle Ages, known from the ancient world up through the Middle Ages as a more of an allegorical or, as I said, symbolic map. It was called a TO map. And if you can see the circle, which represents the world on the top of this tablet, and the little cross thing, you'll get a better idea in this very clear printed picture of a TO map. This was printed in 1472. And what I want to introduce to you is a series of ideas about maps that might have never occurred to you. And one of the things is that maps can be prescribed. Maps don't necessarily have to describe. This is sort of prescribed by theological concepts. In the Middle Ages and even into the ancient world, the idea that the Holy Land was the center of the earth, and therefore, since the earth was the center of the universe, that this is the center of everything. And a TO map such as this has the vertical bar of the T representing the Mediterranean Sea. The top bar to the right is the Nile River. The top bar to the left is the Hellespont and the area up into the Tigris and Euphrates and so on. these major bodies of water separate Africa, Europe, and Asia, which were the three continents that were known to the ancients. So basically, this is the most simple kind of relevant map. And an interesting thing about it is this is one of our first sort of jarring concepts. It introduces us to the word orientation. You know, going into the Renaissance map makers were mathematicians, and they oriented maps in this way. The word orient meaning east, right? So why is it that we orient maps, they face the north? Well, that's just a little contradiction in the way we see maps today. But the oldest tradition in maps is that as you are approaching a landmass, that's what goes on the top of the map. So a map can be oriented to the east or the west or the south or the north and so on. And this is a splendid example of a centuries-old and persistent method of map making where really churches prescribe that maps should be oriented to the east. And that meaning is set. We have two systems of video here today, and on your right is a PowerPoint video. To the left is my sort of old Europe or old Philadelphia style of showing slides. The Historical Society is way ahead of me, that's for sure. The images are just wonderful. But the first sort of modern map that I want to show you with some concepts on the right is a map, a woodblock map done by Sebastian Munster in Basel, Switzerland in 1540. And it's a world map. This is from the Forkey collection. And a principle in map collecting often is that you want to get a map that shows a portion of the world before your subject appears. So here is certainly a map that shows North America before Nebraska existed, for sure. The map that you saw that was of the world was also published at the same time as this map by Sebastian Munster, which is the first map to show North and South America as two separate continents separated by an isthmus. Again, remember the date, 1540. So this is just 50 years after Columbus. By this time, if we sort of start at the bottom of the map and work our way up, you can see the Straits of Magellan at the very bottom. And to the left of the continent of South America, you have Magellan's ship symbolically floating through. Now, one of the things they didn't really have the concept of North America and South America at this time so much as it was America, right, where we talked about the three continents. Interestingly, the West Indies are quite nicely and accurately depicted, and this is due mostly to the Spanish and Portuguese explorations of the time. If you go out to the Pacific Ocean on this map, and I'm showing this map instead of the world map that was part of the Forkey collection and that is in the exhibit, this is just larger and more clear to you. But to the left of North America, or actually the Central America Isthmus, there is an island that is labeled Zipangi. Now, this immediately tells us what the source of this information is, because Zipangi was Marco Polo's name for Japan. And you'll notice that to the left of that, the main island, there's many other islands. And again, it says that this was an archipelago of 4,748 islands. And this is exactly what Marco Polo said. So we know the source for that is Marco Polo. Going over to North America, you see the most primitive kind of depiction of the continent. But what's very interesting is the area right here, where this is a body of water going all the way to the Orient. You'll notice also there's a body of water that goes all the way here. So at this point, there's two sailing routes to the Orient, one through the Straits of Magellan, which was well oriented. There were all kinds of Arctic explorations that were hitting disaster on the North Point. But this is called the False Sea of Verrazano. And there is a manuscript map in the Vatican Library that was drawn by Verrazano, who was an early explorer who went up the east coast of North America. You know, he missed Chesapeake Bay, he missed Delaware Bay, but he did find New York Bay. And he built that big bridge that's over between Brooklyn and New Jersey. You know, so anyway, but Verrazano, the serious part of Verrazano's trip was that when he was going past the outer banks of the Carolinas, he looked across Pamlico Sound and he saw this body of water. And he said, aha, that must be it. That water is going to go. And the far shore was enshrouded in fog. He even described that in his journal. Now, he was practicing a age-old tradition called extrapolation. If you see something, you can guess at it, and you hope for the best. And people wanted to believe that. They wanted to believe there was this easy thing. You get across that sandbar on the Outer Banks, and bingo, you're sailing free to the Orient. But this is the kind of information that was going on. So basically, if you were looking for Nebraska, it would have been underwater on this map. And that's a fascinating thought. Notice that this map from on the right side is in black and white. Most maps up until about the 1850s, most maps were printed in black and white, and then they were colored by hand with watercolors. And there are records and advertisements and things that show they sold for maybe 5 cents more when they were colored as to opposed to black and white and so on. So there is that aspect. The map here was done in 1570. And it was done by a man who is known as the father of modern cartography. His name was Abraham Ortelius. He worked in Antwerp, later moved to Amsterdam. And this would be a map with a lot of geographical concepts of the time. You had some fascinating information in this map. And one of the first things I want to say about it is that it was an attempt, it was a very serious attempt by mathematicians and geographers to tell about the size of the entire world. And you'll notice it's in an oval, and this is called an oval projection. It was formulated by an Italian mathematician named Borzoni, who preached that this line is actually 1/2 of what that line is. So if you can measure this part, then this part must balance it in some way. After all, God would not have created an unbalanced world. And this followed through in a lot of, this concept followed through in a lot of geographical depictions throughout the Renaissance and into the 18th century. There was this sense that if things had to be balanced. It took a long time for geographers to realize that the world was not a perfect circle or perfect sphere, that there were bumps in it and things like that. And all this had telling results in depicting, say, magnetic north and true north, and the very many different concepts in making an accurate map and finding your way by sea or by land. But that was one of the major things. This oval projection is seen in Munster's world map that is in the Forkey collection. The depiction of the poles. Notice this Terra Australis, the southern land. This is where Australia got its name eventually. They had not completely mapped Australia at this time. A lot of people seem to think that Captain James Cook discovered Australia. He did not discover it. The Dutch knew about it 200 years before, but they had never completely sailed around it. Cook was the first to map it completely. and they called it Australia because of this concept of Australis as a continent. They knew a little bit about New Guinea. And another thing is map makers always knew more than they were allowed to publish, or let's say seafarers knew more, because they didn't want to share some of these secrets of where the Spice Islands were and the kinds of roads to wealth. But they knew there was land at the South Pole. They knew there was a great currents coming out of the North Pole. So when they made their map, they wanted to balance this whole thing. And so you have this huge Antarctic continent in the south. And that was something else to notice. By this time, 1570, Jacques Cartier had come out of Saint-Malo. Again, the early fishermen knew so much about the Grand Banks. And it just seems only rational that prior to Columbus, the French fishermen were coming over and getting the codfish off the Grand Banks. But you do see the St. Lawrence River already mapped. It was convenient to Europe. The French had sailed down the river. They had found the little one of the earliest city plans to be published, showing an American city, was a plan of the Indian village Hochelaga, which the French immediately renamed after the king, Mount Royal or Montreal, and so on. So Hochelaga is on this 1570 map. Most of the rest of the continent is very little known. Historians of geography call this the potato configuration of South America. This big bulge down here just didn't exist. But it was later corrected by Ortelius 15 years later, which shows a admirable conscientiousness, because to change a copper plate was not an easy thing. On the right is a map published by an Italian mathematician named Magini, and you can see the Ortelius influence on that map. One of the things Magini wanted to do was to explain the directions of the winds. Of course, in this age of sailing vessels, so you have these little wind heads there that are each given a personality: the cold winds from the north, the warm winds from the south, and so on. On the left is a blown-up picture of the Ortelius map of North and South America, which is just a absolutely beautiful thing. One of the things that the Renaissance cartographers did is if there was an area that they didn't know what was going on, well, they would fill it with decoration, and that was their aesthetic sense. Little ships and sea monsters and so many different things, whales and all that. That was all part of just their love of learning, but their love of decorative arts as well. And that was an important thing for them. But there was also something of a fear of an empty space. I guess they just wanted to fill things up. We were looking at the North Pole according to Ortelius before. A man who, soon after Ortelius began publishing, also made a great name for himself was Gerhard Mercator. You might have heard of the Mercator projection, which was a brilliant theoretical work on how to draw a map of a spheroid world on a flat surface. This is Mercator's depiction of the North Pole. And one of the things you have here is a belief that the North Pole was the source of all water, that there was a great fountain right at the North Pole, and there were 4 rivers that put the water into the world. So here's Scandinavia, here's North America, and so on. And these were the kind of things. There's some islands that they had heard about, but they were looking for. Both islands in this case have been proven to be mythical islands. But this is some of the kind of information that was going on. This is a map of Virginia done by the explorer and soldier and adventurer John Smith. Most of us know about John Smith through Pocahontas saving his life. He was really a mercenary working for the English colonies. Later went to New England and helped with the Indian Wars. But Smith did this map of the Chesapeake Bay, and this is an example of a map that is oriented to the west rather than orient east. And basically, there were two reasons for orienting a map to the west. One is that as a seafarer, you approached the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay from the east, so you would come in and you'd see it that way. The other is a matter of efficiency in using space in a rectangular page of a book or a map pamphlet. The Chesapeake Bay is longest that way, so you put it on paper in that direction. And that would be another consideration by the map maker. So they certainly knew, sometimes people laugh at that map and say, oh, they didn't know where north was. Well, they did. Here's the compass rose and here's the arrow showing north. It was fine. Again, they were showing added information, decorating it with a beautiful compass rose, just of purely architectural beauty, a lovely sailing ship, scale of miles in a Renaissance sort of Mannerist style cartouche, a lovely picture of a warrior from Powhatan's tribe, and this is taken right from an illustrated book published in Frankfurt by Theodore de Bry called the Major Voyages. And over here is showing the interior of Powhatan's Lodge. It's the earliest illustration of the inside of an Indian dwelling in North America. One of the things that fascinates map historians about this map is that as you go up the various rivers, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the James, you get certain area, and there's little Maltese crosses. And what Smith did in trying to do an accurate map of the bay, he put a Maltese cross as far as he physically went. So he was stressing that this is where I went, this is what I saw. Any other information beyond the Maltese cross, it's hearsay. It's what was told to us by the Indians. So this gives us some idea of the interaction with the Indians, of Indians' knowledge of geography. Actually, we need to do. The next map is on the right that I want to talk about, and this was done engraved by a Dutch geographer named Herman Mol, who came to England right around the beginning of the 18th century. And Mol did maps for many people. In this case, he did this map for a book that was written by a scholar named Cluverius. And it's a very simple map of North and South America. But one of the outstanding things about it is on the left, you have a depiction of California as an island. And previous to about this time, California was properly shown as a peninsula. And again, I want to get back to the idea of extrapolation on maps. An English geographer named Briggs read reports of people who had gone up Baja California Bay, and they didn't go all the way up the bay. And so they just wrote that, it probably empties into the northern Pacific. Well, they just didn't go that far to find the Colorado River. So this was just taken, but it was also taken because, again, this is what they wanted to believe. The thing of it is Francis Drake had gone up the entire California, present-day Oregon and Washington coast, and everywhere you can see the mountains from there. Francis Drake had written, "There is no Northwest Passage." Well, if you know that Francis Drake went up the left side of the California there, and then you can prove that Francis Drake really saw an island, then the possibility of a Northwest Passage once again exists, and all that real estate is worth a lot more than it used to be worth. And so just to put it in terms for an economist or so, this was an important thing. The next map that I want to show you is a very important map which was produced in England in a response to a lot of the cartographic reforms that were going on especially in France and with the Italian mathematicians. This is called the Wright-Molyneux map. I'm sorry it's a little light, but it's a very exacting but very sketchy world map. It is the first actually printed map on a Mercator projection. Gerhard Mercator, 130 years previously, had formulated the Mercator projection, but he never did a map on the Mercator projection, which is an interesting thing. But by this time, there were so many ships at sea. The British Navy was established, and one of the things you'll notice about the coast of North America, say in our quest for the West on a Northwest Passage, is that where they don't have the information, there is nothing. And that was a very important addition to concepts of map making that was produced at that time. The map on the right is from the Forkey collection. Again, this is another map that shows California as an island. It's an absolutely lovely map. The title cartouche has a little cherub there. They've still got 1 foot in the Italian Renaissance with decorativeness. But then another thing to notice on this map is the projection. This is called a sinusoidal projection. And this was formulated by French mathematicians in the 18th century. They wanted to, rather than have straight lines for your meridians, they realized that these lines fanned out from the poles, and that this showed, continents to best advantage. Again, this is the only way. Remember, no one had walked across North America yet. And this was an attempt to show the size of North America. On the left is a map done in 1703 by a French geographer named Guillaume de Lisle. Now, the de Lisles were a family of French map makers that stayed in the map trade through sons and grandsons for about 80 years. The founder was the geographer for the king, and they were a very well-established family of French geographers. This is a map done in 1703, which is one of the earliest to show the Mississippi River on its proper meridian. Prior to this, most maps showed the Mississippi River about 500 miles too far west. Up until the time of LaSalle, you just didn't even have a Mississippi River. They just knew there was a great confluence of water coming out of there. Notice the English colonies. The colonies were established by the Tudor kings by marking 2 points on the Atlantic coast, and then continuing the colony, actually by law, going all the way to the Pacific. That would have made Virginia quite a large piece of real estate. Now, the interesting thing is, why doesn't this map show it going all the way? Well, one of the things is the Europeans transferred to America at this time just couldn't conceive of going west of the Mississippi River. It was said by many that it would just never fill up. It's inhabitable. And of course, this was another reason they thought it was just fine to remove the Indians there, because the Indians could go there and nobody would bother them and they wouldn't bother anybody and this sort of thing. But we know that, subsequent history proved that wrong. But this is a map that tells that kind of story of what was going on. And it's about as an accurate a map as you can get in these times. This is another map that was done from surveys by Delisle. I selected a map by a British geographer done in 1720 by a man named John Senex in London. Now, Senex just copied Delisle's map line for line. And again, it puts the Mississippi River on its proper meridian, but it also is the first map to show some kind of accuracy of the Ohio River, and then a concept of the Missouri and the Platte and the Arkansas River and so many of the others in the western lands. It's remarkable for its time to be done in 1720. On the right is a map. Notice again, California is an island. This was done by a man named Thomas Kitchen in England. It is called, this is by Belin. It is called Amérique Septentrionale. And again, California is shown as an island, but at the same time you have a number of enticing rivers, going to the west, a series of lakes in the North Country. Often these lakes are connected by little waterways or little dotted lines that will indicate that this is a portage, and making it look very easy, for a person to voyage that way and again get to the Orient. This is another map by Bowen in London, and again it's showing the English colonies. Notice the decorative elements of the cartouche. It's no longer a Dutch mannerism. This is sort of very light and lovely Baroque, influenced by French aesthetics at the time. And a map like this, again, the whole La Louisiane is a huge area. As the European powers began to, fight over North America, you suddenly have this kind of configuration. And notice the maps become far less decorative as you get into what's called the modern world. But in this case, you have this map of the whole area, and it's a British map of the whole continent. One of the things, I know it's hard for you to see this, and fortunately the Historical Society has put little magnifying glasses out in a box along the, and it really rewards to look at some of these maps with that kind of information that is so small and lovely in there. This is another map, in this case coming out of London, and what's admirable about this map is that it names the United States of America for the first time. Actually, at an early time. I shouldn't say this isn't the very first map to say United States of America or États-Unis, but England is now recognizing the United States as the owner of this land, and they're filling in the states, and the Western progress is very much evident here. Then you have this also is from the Forkey collection, and you have this map of the Northwest Territories of the United States. once the Articles of Confederation were done, the British had finally evacuated New York City, and the Treaty of Paris was signed. You then had this very large Northwest territory that was going to form the future states of the United States, and that was an area of great contention. Again, west of the Mississippi wasn't really an option, and this is as late as the year 1805 that such maps would be produced. This map was done by a man named Jedediah Morse, who is often called the father of American geography, because he published so many atlases, and he also published school book maps, and was very involved in setting up standards for students and young people to know about geography. Jedediah Morse, interestingly, was the father of Sidney Morse, who was a geographer who worked on into the 1850s, but he was also the father of Samuel F.B. Morse, who invented the telegraph, who brought the daguerreotype to America, and so on and so forth. Quite an American family. This map was done by Samuel Lewis. It is a map of La Louisiane, done in Boston in 1805. So here we are, right at the time that Lewis and Clark are about to take off on their voyage. Actually, they're on their way at this point, and it's but the information is certainly pre-Lewis and Clark. The absence of the two great mountain ranges of the West is striking here. There was a theory that lasted well into this time, and it was espoused by Thomas Jefferson, again hopeful that the west side of the Mississippi River in the North American continent would equal in topography the east side. So the Americans saw that there was this one mountain range, the Appalachians, and that there was this incredible enthusiasm and optimism by engineers and scientists that, oh yes, we can build canals to go over the Appalachian Mountains, as you had the C&O Canal in going out of Washington, D.C. This was one of George Washington's great projects. Of course, later the Erie Canal did exactly that, but it was able to find an area of the Appalachians where it wasn't that steep. But there was hopes that there was one mountain range in the West, and that there would be rivers going up where there would just be, maybe a mile or two that you would be able to accomplish that and get a canal going. But this was one of the major elements that was disproven by the Lewis and Clark expedition. Be sure to take a long look at this map when you look at the exhibition from the Forkey collection. This is Carey and Lee's map of what they're calling the Arkansas Territory. It's one of the first great trans-Mississippi West maps that reflects the information brought back by Lewis and Clark. It includes information from Zebulon Pike and a number of other shorter expeditions in American history. Now, the date on that is 1822. And you wonder why, 10, 15 years after Lewis and Clark, they're finally getting this information out. Well, there was a terrific muddle when Lewis and Clark came back, that the maps and the documents and so much went to, Lewis and Clark took them to Jefferson in the White House. There was discussion on who would do what with them. Meriwether Lewis died soon after. They don't know whether it was from suicide or he was murdered in a small tavern in Kentucky. William Clark, who was the most able person to bring all this together, to publish a map, to write about the geology and the botany and the biology of the expedition, Jefferson asked him to do it. He said yes, and then Jefferson appointed him as the governor of the Missouri Territory, which was just an enormous job, and the poor man just could never do it. So there was a considerable delay in issuing this information. But this is just a superb map of that kind of information. And Carey and Lee were political economists, basically, and publishers in Philadelphia. In fact, they considered themselves the American foils to the English school of economics, which was called the gloomy school, you might have heard, where they were predicting famine and pestilence and decline of the world. Whereas Carey and Lee were saying, this is wonderful, America is going to be the great, power release where, extra people can come and immigrants can come and they'll find wealth and health and so on and so forth. And so the text is just beautifully written about all the wonderful things to be found here. So this is really the first part of our talk, where I wanted to just show you a selection of maps. I didn't want to just refer things cold to you that would be on the floor. But then in this framework, think about the men Lewis and Clark. And they were fascinating fellows. And they came out of Virginia. There's a number of things to be said about their origins in the American colony of Virginia. They were born just about the time that the American Revolution was really heating up. And Lewis and Clark knew the great Virginians of the Revolution. Actually, my period of history is the American Revolution. And I've read so much about it and seen so much. I'm really convinced that despite all the hubbub in Boston and the wars fought in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and various things in Maryland, still, it wouldn't have been a revolution without the Virginians. The Virginians were giants. I mean, physically, Washington and Jefferson were very tall men. Madison and Monroe might not have been structural giants, but they were giants of intellect. They certainly were. Washington and Jefferson were both map makers. On your bibliography here, I've mentioned a book by Sarah Hughes called Surveyors and Statesmen. And she talks about the Virginia surveyors. And just in recent years, I've found that a number of state surveyor associations have books, or they have published books about surveyors, and they're fascinating. Usually when we buy our house, somebody surveyed it, and it was usually set up by somebody else, and you never meet these people. But in the Virginia colonies, surveying was one of the great roads to wealth. And I have to remind you that George Washington was one of these surveyors. Interestingly, the surveyors were very well-educated men of their times because they had to know a lot about the map-making and the map-making traditions. They had to know their mathematics. Many of them, the Virginia surveyors, came from the University of Edinburgh. They came out of Scotland. A number of them had done surveying in the West Indies. It doesn't take that long to do a survey of the complete island of Barbados. Then you come up and get into Virginia. Now, the interesting thing is a road to wealth. These surveyors were working for landowners. Most of the landowners had very little cash. You didn't pay a surveyor in cash. You gave them 10% of the land they surveyed. Wow. Well, also the surveyor knew what was the best 10% as well, and so on. And this is the kind of thing that Washington did. Not only were they intelligent men, but they were also very strong and very hardworking. To survey a lot and plot, to draw a baseline and so on, you had to cut down trees, you had to climb over rocks and up hills and so on. It was not an easy job, but it took a lot of stamina, and they did it. Washington was supposed to be just great at that. He had a terrific reputation. So And I guess maybe it's worthwhile saying something about George Washington and how his surveying experience characterized the rest of his life. It's almost a cliche to say, oh yeah, George Washington, first president, great man, popular and all this sort of thing. But doggone, Washington, the more I read about him, it's just phenomenal what the man did. For instance, many of us have read that Washington accompanied General Braddock, and when the French and Indians ambushed them on their way to present-day Pittsburgh or Fort Duquesne, that Washington saved the army by getting the colonial troops rallied and then fighting against the Indians and so on. But one of the bigger things that Washington did after that was enable his American colonial compatriots to collect their pay. The British government did not pay them in money. It paid them in land claims in the West. Well, they didn't want to go, many of those men didn't want to go back to the Indian country and be ambushed again. Many of those men didn't want to do the hard work of surveying, but who was it got the group together? George Washington pulled the group together, went out and surveyed that land and made claims for those veterans. He was just that kind of guy. I was very impressed when I read a detailed account of the Battle of Trenton many years ago. And, we see this wonderful picture by Emanuel Lutze of Washington crossing the Delaware, one of the most famous icons in American history. Washington standing on the boat and pushing the ice floes aside. Okay, he crossed the Delaware and he went and surprised a bunch of drunk Hessians and so on and won the battle. But it was much, much more than that. What most people don't realize is that when the Continental Army was going to attack the British Army in Trenton, there was a plan, and they sent 3 columns to cross the Delaware. And if all 3 columns had done what they were supposed to have done, they would have come in from different sides and captured the entire British Army. Washington crossed the Delaware, got there on time. Another column got there one day late, and the 3rd column never made it across the river. I mean, it's that kind of thing that made him the man that he was. And I know this is a digression beyond maps, but it also says something about who made the maps back then and formulated the American frontier. So, I think the fact that Virginians knew that these were all part of the lore, and the Meriwether family, the Lewis family, they were all Virginians who Washington owned land with some of Lewis and Clark's ancestors, and on and on. So this was all part of what was going on. There's a book here about that that's in your bibliography. I wrote the 2nd chapter in this book dealing with the 18th century. So this is where I did a lot of that kind of research. It's the last book in the bibliography that I gave you by Richard Stevenson and published by the Library of Virginia. It's a great big book, and it has these fold-out maps that are just wonderful to see and to study. Well, if we step back into Virginia history, we see more about what was influencing Lewis and Clark. In the late 17th century, most of Virginia was of the Cavalier tradition, the men who were given land by the Stuart kings. By the very late 17th and the early 18th century, many, especially French Huguenots, were coming over from Europe. They had been expelled from France by the Catholic powers, and they brought a lot of scientific savvy into the community of America, and especially the American South, South Carolina, especially around Charleston with its Huguenot influence, and also Virginia. And there's many old Virginia family names. But the interesting thing, of course, is that they were a second great wave of immigrants to come to Virginia, and most of the best land was taken. So they went west over the Appalachian Mountains and into the Valley of Virginia and started a progression of western migration at that time. There was also another group of Germans and what are called the Scotch-Irish that came out of central Pennsylvania and again down the Valley of Virginia to claim land. A professor at Davidson College, which is a Presbyterian college in North Carolina, once said to me that these Scotch-Irish were very fervid religious people, and that they kept the Sabbath and everything they could get their hands on. And the poor Indians didn't have a chance. But these were the people that settled western part of Virginia. Then they went through the Cumberland Gap and into Kentucky. And there's an absolutely wonderful book that I would recommend to you. It's on the bibliography here. It's called Bound Away, Virginia and the Westward Movement by David Hackett Fisher and James C. Kelly, published by University of Virginia Press. By the way, David Hackett Fisher has recently published a book, or written a book that's just been published called About the Battle of Trenton. I haven't read it yet, but I have a feeling he has the same approach to discovering Washington's valor and strength in winning that. I did read a review that said, by the way, the Hessians weren't drunk, so we shouldn't sell ourselves short. David Hackett Fisher also wrote a book called Paul Revere's Ride, which is a really nifty book. It's on Books on Tape. That's the way I read it on a long trip. And he talks about how Paul Revere's experience was so different than Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem. So anyway, Fisher is really a fun and a very good historian. So these people were coming into Virginia and moving out into Kentucky, and they realized the value of surveying and of making maps to control land, to make a place where the land is safe. This tradition goes back to, as I said, the earliest map making on a scientific basis, being done right at the end of the 17th and early 18th century in France by people like the Delisle family and others. France was first scientifically mapped using methods of triangulation it started in about 1690, and it took 50 years for this to be done because of the difficulty in it. You would think a civilized land like France would find it. But they found that France was about 150 miles wider than anybody had ever believed before. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the king's finance minister, was just delighted because it raised taxes so much. But at the same time, the landowners and the nobles who controlled this land were not too happy at all about this. But again, maps and map making raised controversy, and as a number of map historians, such as Lloyd Brown in his Story of Maps, says, time after time, the map makers won because they found that the advantages were better than the disadvantages, but there was always a controversy. As James Kelly and David Hackett Fisher show, the Virginians just poured into the Kentucky region, and so too did the Lewis family and the Clark family. They all later went to Kentucky, and that was the near frontier. Later, those Virginians went through southern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Illinois, out into Missouri. There's a whole range of indications to this day of family names, of place names, of even this sort of string of military schools that was sort of a southern tradition in the mid-19th century survives through that belt. So these were the kind of things that Lewis and Clark were aware of, the people they were aware of. By the time Lewis and Clark were about ready to go, poor map-making procedures were pretty much out. There were no more maps to be made exclusively from narratives. Extrapolation was absolutely not allowed. Symmetrical geography, where you believe that everything was balanced and everything, well, we're not going to do that anymore. There was a sort of theories from time to time called pyramidical heights, where it was believed that water came out of a central place, so that if you found one body of water to the east and one to the west, it was going to meet at some central place and be very close. But that too is set aside. So I did want to show you two items from the period just before Lewis and Clark, from the late 1780s and 1790s, that were done. And is it possible to turn on this light over here? Great. And I brought something from my shop, which is an incredibly rare artifact. And I'm going to leave it out on the table for people to see it up close. It's a map by a geographer named Thomas Hutchins. And Hutchins was a British Army officer and engineer who did a number of maps for the British Army at the beginning of the American Revolution. He had been in America long enough that he decided that the Americans were correct, and he liked America. Being an officer, he was allowed to go back to London, honorably resigned his commission, and came back and became a map maker for the Continental Army. This is a map done of the Ohio Valley by Thomas Hutchins. It's in a particular format that is called a holster map. It's in its original paper case. It was cut into sections and laid on canvas. And it sort of shows the American frontier in the late 1780s. This particular copy is actually given here. It belonged to a man named de Benville, who was a surgeon in the Continental Army. And this was his own copy of Hutchins' map. Now, I'm going to unfold it, leave it on the table. You're welcome to look at it. Don't sneeze on it. As a merchant, I have a price on this map. It's $55,000. But it's worth sharing. Interestingly, and getting back to, well, let me just show you how this thing works. And actually, when you come up, you can touch it. It's backed on a very heavy linen, much more than linen. It's probably more cloth, but it opens up. And this is the way someone would have a map in the field, as opposed to an atlas, which would be in a library. And it's quite a large map. And yeah, anyway, this is give you some idea of it. But I'd rather leave it flat on the table and you can see it that way. Thomas Hutchins also did another map, and this is getting us back to Nebraska. Thomas Hutchins did the first map of the Platte system of the United States. I'm sure everybody here must know more about the Platte system than I do, being from Nebraska. But the Platte system, of course, as you all know, was set up by the Articles of Confederation in 1785. And the United States government needed to experiment. And this is an area of Ohio called the Seven Ranges of Townships. And this was the prototype Platte map that was going to be used for all the western states right after the American Revolution. And the left side, your right side of this map, is the Ohio River, basically. This is in northeastern part of Ohio. And it's a fascinating map. You can also see, as you watch the lines, the very simple lines here, every little creek is noted on here as a touchstone to where this, each of these sections is located. So this is a wonderful example of the kind of things that were going on in America. This is the kind of thing that Lewis and Clark were aware of. I think that whole mapping tradition was something that Lewis and Clark were so aware of as they set off. There's a couple of other books in the bibliography that I gave out. If you didn't get a copy, there's more on the table by the door, as well as a little brochure about my shop. But they were so aware of that tradition. And I was going to say there's a couple of books that just talk about Lewis and Clark and the material they had. There's a wonderful book from the Missouri Historical Society, another one from Lewis and Clark College out in Oregon. So anyway, but that takes you up to the sort of the start-off point. If you come and visit Philadelphia as a tourist, which I would love you to do because Philadelphia, like every city, loves tourists, you can even get a little map at the visitor center that'll take you on a tour of where Lewis and Clark went shopping for the materials for the Lewis and Clark expedition. But the most important thing, too, is that Jefferson started a tradition and a policy with the United States government to send out expeditions. And every expedition, included the arts and the sciences and the maps and so on. Prior to that, most countries had, relied on, royal patronage or some sort of the whim of a wealthy noble or something like that. But in post-revolutionary Europe, in post-revolutionary America, Jefferson started this. It all started with Lewis and Clark, and it's so much a part of our Western heritage. That's it. Should I ask for questions or any questions? Bless you.
Maybe you didn't remember the core discovery 100